Thank you for joining us for Community Focus. Amy Simpson and I are on the road again. In fact, we are sitting here sipping tea in the F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum in Old Cloverdale here in Montgomery. Our special guest is Dr. Kurt Kernut. Kurt is Vice President of the F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum. He is also Vice President of the International Fitzgerald Society, and he is Chair of the English Department at Troy University Montgomery campus. Thank you, Kurt, for joining us again for our second On the Road segment at the Fitzgerald Museum.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always wonderful to be with you.
And it's a pleasure to be in Zelda and F. Scott's living room. Was this their living room?
I think this was the sitting room. There's a lot of debate about exactly what was what because, the house was redone at some point in the 40s and broken into apartments. So nobody has really ever been able to kind of clarify, but this would seem to be the natural living room and the bedrooms upstairs. So.
Speaking of artifacts, are there any photographs of the way the house looked while they lived in it?
We have not been able to locate anything like that. The 6 months that they were here was a very difficult time in their lives, and I just don't think I think they were hesitant to have any sort of photographic documentation. We have all kinds of pictures of the house they subsequently lived in Maryland, which was a little calmer period for them. But to my knowledge, I have not seen any of the house in Montgomery.
And they lived here in
They were here from the fall of 1931 through the spring of 32. So it was about a 6-month period.
And what happened while they were here? Talk about some of the significant events that occurred while they lived here.
Well, the most significant, I think, was the fact that they came here in order to settle down, and they'd been living high on the Roaring Twenties hog for many years, and then in 1930, Zelda had suffered a breakdown that basically had her in a sanitarium for 15 months, and so when she was finally able to leave, they decided they would come back to the United States. Keep in mind, this is almost concurrent with the onset of the Great Depression. I mean, you can almost chart the breakdown according to what's going on in a grander economic scale. So they knew they were living on reduced circumstances. There was money problems. He was suffering from a lot of alcoholic issues and not able to write constantly. So Montgomery offered them an opportunity to live on a much smaller scale, theoretically, and to have a much more settled existence. Her father was also terribly ill when they came back, and shortly after they returned, he died. And that was a huge, I think, issue for Zelda. It's really at the core of Save Me the Waltz, which is the novel that she began to conceive while she was here in Montgomery and subsequently wrote the bulk of it up in Baltimore. So it was a very trying 6 months for him. He was actually gone for a great deal of that time because he was in California trying to write for the movies and make a steady income. So it was a short but intense period, and I think in a positive sense it did give them a little breather in that both were able to finally sit down and kind of put together the novels that each was working on, her Save Me the Waltz and his Tender as the Night.
Kurt, you're considered a Fitzgerald scholar. Having studied the Fitzgeralds for so many years, what are some of the myths that surround them that you'd like to straighten out?
Well, I think, the myths, it's interesting because I think the myths are really two extremes of the pendulum. On the one hand, you have the myth that they represent one of the greatest love stories ever told. In order to buy that, you really have to ignore the 1930s and sort of the descent that they had and the fact that they weren't they never divorced, but they weren't really together at the end of his life. When people talk about the greatest romance ever, they're really talking about the period in 1918 and 1919 in which he was courting her in Montgomery, which for all intents and purposes was a was an adolescent romance. I mean, she was 18 and 19 years old, and he was a few years older. But it was, you know, it was kind of a very passionate but also very melodramatic affair where, you know, whenever he was gone, she would go out with the star quarterback at Auburn, and that would get back to him, and he'd write all these frenzied letters and sending her gifts and trying to win her over. And he really writes magically of that pursuit of her in a lot of his pieces, both the fiction and the nonfiction. The other extreme of that is the notion, and unfortunately it's been perpetuated by a lot of biographies, that he is somehow responsible for her mental illness. You know, the idea is that he took her creativity, used it in his novels and stories, and essentially appropriated her life, leaving her no identity of her own, that subsequently threw her into schizophrenia. The reality is there's a family history of mental illness. Her brother committed suicide in the period in which they were also, I think shortly after they were in Montgomery. But there's a long history of that in the family that can't be overlooked. And it should not be ignored that he never abandoned Zelda. To the end of his life, he was paying for her, you know, to stay in mental sanitariums, and was taking care of her as best he could. So there was a bond there that I think at the end of the day, it's one of those marriages that you look at and you know, you really realize that they went through the ringer both because of themselves and because of the times in which they lived.
And I've been told, perhaps you can clarify this rumor, that there aren't many works of art by Zelda left.
Yeah.
Because she had instructed her mother to burn them upon her death.
I'm not sure she instructed her mother. Her mother and her sister did destroy many of the paintings after she died because they were disturbed by them. And again, keep in mind this is a period in time in which mental illness was considered a stigma. And they had been through many years. This is 1947, 48, so you know, they had been through almost 20 years of her being in and out of sanitariums. And I think you can't overlook the fact that she died as a patient in a sanitarium that caught on fire. And so I think in some ways their destroying a lot of canvases was a way of them to kind of purge that sadness. And it's understandable in that way. The great news is that there are surviving canvases, and the ones that are surviving have been on tour now for several years, and it really does dramatize the extent of her talent. Some of my favorite pieces that she did, for example, were paper dolls, which is a kind of a folk art if you think about it. And she did wonderful paintings, wonderful paper dolls, excuse me. And she also did wonderful kind of Fantasia pieces. She did a whole reinterpretation of Alice in Wonderland at the end of her life, which is a really neat series of paintings.